Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 in Destination Planning and Management. This lecture is talking about sustainable planning concepts across contexts. Hopefully I should be able to get through this lecture and actually use those terms the way they're supposed to be used. I apologise if I get tongue-tied. Today, here we go. All right, so today I'll be talking firstly about context, what context is and why it's important, the components of context, which is place, polity and power, or that's one way of looking at context, it's not the only component of context, talking about mobile policies across contexts, and destination resilience, and then I'll try and draw in why these are all important ideas to consider together. Okay, you can see here there's an image on the left, and it's a picture of the Markets and Fishermen's Village in Beaupart in northern Koh Samui. It's a place we went, there's some friends of mine in there, and that has a really interesting feel. It's very location dependent, very context dependent. There's an amazing Buddhist monastery nearby, which is a really fantastic tourist attraction. There's cheap grog, cheap clothes, fantastic food. It's a truly eclectic experience that has a real buzz about it, and it's very Thai. Now, I've been to similar markets in Bali and had wonderful experiences there, the Philippines, Malaysia, all sorts of different places. And there is an Asian feel to the markets, but there's also a specific feel that's different across each of those Asian contexts. Some of them are really subtle. They're to do with cultural values and whether to be hawking your wares or whether you sit there and wait for people to come to you, harassing passers-by. There's a whole bunch of different cultural things. There's different products, different resources available, different cleanliness standards, different weather. So there's a whole bunch of key things that are worth thinking about in terms of the context which influence how things are done and what the tourist experience of the product is. And so that's essentially what I'm talking about today. Okay, so I've also included this image to the left. It's a can from Cairns. It's from a place between Port Douglas and Cairns. As I'm saying this, I'm thinking I may have mentioned this in the last lecture actually, but a lot of the locals, there's a lot of people that stop on the side of the road between Cairns and Port Douglas and they make a big stack of rocks like this, and there's hundreds of them all over the place. You can see them in the background. And it's really quite a spectacle. A lot of tourists really love it because they can come and make a contribution to the environment in a sort of non-destructive kind of way. But there are other residents who say that they really don't like it because they say that it doesn't really represent us, which I find quite ironic given they're called Cairns and we're in Cairns. But nonetheless, there are some people who think that that's not really our culture and so we shouldn't be doing it. Personally don't agree with them, but it's always interesting to think about other people's arguments and why they're making them, because that can be really important when you're trying to convince people to take on change and to move forward with planning ideas and investment ideas. Okay, so the learning outcome for this lecture is to assist you in describing and critiquing a range of strategic concepts and theories and their application to sustainable destination planning and management. Okay, so this is a strategic, the idea of context and mobile policies and destination resilience is a strategic concept or are strategic concepts in sustainable destination planning and management. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss the readings, but they're there for you to have a look at. If you don't have time to read them all, that's fine. Read the abstract, read maybe the introduction and the conclusion. If you find it fascinating, you can't put it down, read the whole lot. You don't need to. A lot of them are just sort of written with rigour, so there's lots of information in there that you don't need. Really just so I can get the basic points of what they're trying to communicate. Okay, so context. Because this is a tourism planning subject, I have looked at both planning and tourism to join these concepts together to think about how both, because they're very separate disciplines, tourism and planning, to have a look at how both of those have approached context. And I did this a long time ago, and it's really interesting because they have a lot of similarities in how they approach context. So people who study tourism have come up with very similar ideas to people who have studied urban planning and urban design. However, and planning in general, however, they don't really engage with each other in their spaces. They don't draw from each other for inspiration. They're coming up with their own. So independently, two disciplines have come up with very similar ideas. So I'm going to contrast those. So urban design and planning and tourism have both come up with this idea that place, polity and power are key aspects of understanding the milieu or the context that either of the city or of the destination. Okay, so I've done a lot of work on practically applying this idea of place, polity and power, and I'm going to show you some of the ways that I've done that and show how it can be a beneficial tool when you're thinking about tourism destination planning. Okay, I'll talk about the Cairns context in this case, but you can think about this in the context of other places if you understand some of the history and so forth and the way things are done where you live or places that you've visited. Okay, and then I'll feed that back into the idea of context. Okay, now apologies for the really crappy image of London. It's not that easy to pilfer images of London off the internet, and I only have close-up ones of my own, not far away ones like that. Okay, so this is London. Now, the reason I'm giving you this image of London is because this is where our planning policies have come from. We're a colonial place, and the fundamentals of our planning policies have been imported from the UK. Now, America too, but the godfather or mother of urban planning and building cities and creating places is London. That's where it really all started. And of course, Cairns is a little different. We have really different climatic conditions, cultural conditions, practically everything. I like this picture because it's got fake kangaroos jumping around in the middle of the square. But this is really interesting because there's a lot of policies that we live by in Cairns that have been generated originally from London or perhaps the United States. In fact, a lot of building practices, a lot of engineering practices, because the money for the innovation is actually in those places, it tends to generate that stuff, and because we don't have the money to generate our own innovation, we tend to adapt and adopt things rather than actually creating things ourselves. Now, that's quite efficient in some ways because you might end up with stuff that's not actually, you don't have to spend a lot of money on something that you probably would have come up with anyway, as long as you can adapt and adopt things and adapt them to your local environment. But there are many examples in Cairns and in cities all over the world where an international style or a trendy style has actually gone in without really considering the specificities of the local place. Okay. So in tourism, Michael Hall, who's one of the most widely cited tourism people on earth, is a very prolific writer, he says that tourism policy cannot be separated from the milieu in which it evolves. Okay, context is important. That's what he's saying there. In planning, Carmona, slightly more verbosely, says how we act today is shaped by an accumulated history of experience and practice, by established ways of doing things that change only very slowly and that are still, despite globalisation, very place dependent, and by the fact that real innovation in design is rare. Now, what he's saying there, he's saying lots of things, and this is just one example of what he's saying, but what he's saying is that, again, everything about us, who we are and what we are, is shaped by where we've come from, and that's very unique to every place and every city. So it's every city, every destination, each one is different, has its own very uniqueness. It's just like a human being. Even siblings, they're similar, might have similar ways about them, but the ingredients that go into them are inevitably different, and the results are going to be different too. So understanding them could also be different. Okay, so I guess the idea of place, polity and power, or policy, power and places, Hall put to us in his Tourism and Politics book in 1996. The idea is trying to provide a framework through which we can look at a destination and try and make sense of it. We're not trying to apply something across all destinations as such. We're trying to use this as a lens to look through in a structured way so we can have a better understanding of context. In planning, Carmona, as part of a model of urban design process, he suggested that place, polity and power are like a sort of a almost like a pyramid, or target, like you can see here. So place is everything that happens because of where you are physically. Polity is the laws that and processes that are created to manage that place, and power are the networks that enact those policies, those laws and processes to manage the place, and they are all interlinked, and that's what they're saying. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Cairns is a good example because I've done it before and I know it. Now, you love my little picture here where the two little points of the Cairns CBD aren't actually converging on Cairns. I must have got that wrong when I was putting it in, sorry. Okay, so Cairns, if you don't know, Cairns is in northern Queensland. And the CBD is at a little inlet there where we can have some cruise ships and so forth arriving, and it's quite sheltered because our prevailing winds are from the southeast. Okay, in the 1890s, Cairns was already receiving tourists coming up from Melbourne for the summer, especially via steamships. There were no roads linking Cairns or railways at that point, linking Cairns to the rest of the world. So all arrivals were by ship or really, really adventurous horsemen. Or birds. Okay, so this is so Cairns hasn't been around for that long, but right from the very start, people in Melbourne who were freezing their butts off in probably a lot colder conditions, they didn't have the heating efficiencies that they have today, or building efficiencies. The wealthy would come to Cairns to take in the cool tropical waters in some of our lakes and streams. The beach was not considered appealing because even at that early stage, it was known that stingers and deadly animals like crocodiles existed in our waters, and it was likely that people might die. So people tended to come to Cairns in the time where it was coolest. The snakes weren't as active up here, and people were able, so it's cool in Cairns, so it was not horribly oppressively hot, but it was a lot warmer than Melbourne. Okay, in 1924, massive big deal happened. The railway opened up. So you could suddenly catch a train to Cairns. I'm not 100% sure if you catch it all the way to Brisbane. I think you might have been able to, but I think quite a lot of people would catch the train to, say, Innisfail and then catch the boat to Cairns before then. But the big deal, I guess, is what I'm really saying is that Cairns opened up to railway, and rail journeys started emerging as another way of travel, which had a massive impact on how Cairns developed as a tourist destination. Okay, Cairns destination now, 1950s. It's got motels, it's got the train, it's got some planes coming in. The World War II came along, and we were one of the bases for the Battle of the Coral Sea. And so there was this massive big, our airport was developed, and so people were able to start flying in here, and air travel was becoming something that people were doing. Steamships were still coming, rail was still coming. People could drive here now because there were roads, and people were starting to arrive by air. Okay, 1979, massive big deal for Cairns is because the Commonwealth Games were secured for Brisbane. The Queensland government took on a massive campaign to start promoting Queensland, and what they did was the Queensland government decided how Cairns would be sold, who to, and the Queensland Travel and Tourist Commission, I think it was created to sell Queensland to the world. They weren't relying on the Australian government to sell them. They said, no, we're going to do this ourselves and we're going to do it well. And they did. They did it very well. Okay, in 1984, the locals in Cairns had got together in the late 1980s and decided that they needed to have an international airport because of our proximity to Asia. So they got together and the Port Authority got together with a whole bunch of very influential locals, mayors and so forth, and actually secured funding to build the international airport, which opened in 1984. All of a sudden, people could fly direct from Japan to Cairns, and Japan was the place back then. That's, you know, there was a booming market, and it totally changed the face of Cairns. Okay, in the 1980s, people were coming for the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef had been listed as a World Heritage, was listed as a World Heritage Area, and so were the wet tropics. But both of those were done without the permission or the enthusiasm of local authorities, local people, or the state government. The way the World Heritage listing works is it's an international agreement, and as such, the national federal government can make a decision for the World Heritage Area to be listed without permission from the states, because of its thing called Section 52 in the Australian Constitution, they are allowed to. It gives the federal government power to sign international agreements and commit tracts of land to international agreements such as the such as the World Heritage Area, such as the Ramsar Wetlands Agreement, such as the Kyoto Protocol, and it's mostly environmental stuff, but it goes across a few different things. So the shaping of Cairns, a lot of Cairns has happened because of what other people have done from the outside. Cairns itself, I don't know if I painted this story very well, but Cairns itself hasn't actually been able to generate a lot of its own stuff. It has had to allow, because of funding, investment, a whole bunch of other things, it's sort of just allowed things to wash over it and things to happen to it. It hasn't had an active planning process, really. Some of it has been, but a lot of it hasn't been. Okay, so context themes, geopolitics, okay, place. It's a regional, so a factor of place is that it's a regional remote city. So this is looking at Cairns in terms of this place, quality and power sort of lens, okay? So a factor of place is it's a regional and remote city. It's the policy that has arisen from this is that the policies are administered in larger cities more than 2,000 kilometres south of Cairns, so they don't understand a lot of the climatic issues. For example, we have huge amounts of rainfall here, but still the government for a long time tried to enforce a compulsory water tank storage policy for new homes in Cairns in response to, and in North Queensland, in response to the drought that had happened in Brisbane. So they were responding to Brisbane issues with statewide policies that weren't relevant to Cairns. Okay, and this resulted to, and access to the region is also a policy priority. So pretty much everything that are really big issues for Cairns is about making sure that we've got more international flights, a bigger cruise ship terminal, better roads, no flood restrictions, and so on and so forth. Most of our policies are about making sure people can continue to access Cairns, because tourism is such a massive deal for Cairns. Cairns receives over 3 million visitors a year now, which makes it one of the most visited destinations in Australia, and it relies most fundamentally over any other industry. It relies on tourism. So the power is that there's not a lot of power. There's not a lot of power in self-determination in the region. Okay, it's a tropical place. All state and federal, so that's a factor of place. In terms of polity, all state and federal laws and policies administered in non-tropical places with little scope for tropically specific amendments, such as the water tank scenario or building codes. so forth. Limited power in the region to override or adapt state and federal policies to the tropical context, okay? And now, I'm not going to go through all of these because it takes forever, but you can have a look at this in terms of the geopolitics, the economy. So we've got a narrow economic base, slow economic growth, the polity, so you can read through those. But this is showing you how you can, in a structured way, break down the context of a place and think about how it functions and how things are done. It relies on a sensitive environment. People, it's got a rich cultural heritage, issues with our Indigenous people and disenfranchisement because of land that's been stolen from them in the past and continues to be. We have limitations on our design. Now you can see I am trying to break this down in a palatable way, the structure of the context. Now, of course, it's not an exact science, and of course you can't actually do it entirely 100%, just like you can't know someone entirely, you can't really know a place entirely either. But this can give us some grit, some things to sink our teeth into to understand about our place, about the heart of who we are as a city, or a heart of any city, to have a look at that and see how it works. Okay, so the context themes. Okay, geopolitics, so regional, city, tropical place. So this is just a summary of what I showed you there. So you can actually have an overlay of geopolitics, economic, environmental and cultural issues in terms of place, polity and power. Okay, now why is this all important? What's important to try and understand context is because almost all, as I mentioned before about London and policies, is that almost all of the policies that we use in Cairns, or that we have in Cairns, have an origin elsewhere. Maybe from Melbourne, maybe from Brisbane, maybe from London. But in London, it doesn't just have policies from London. London has policies from France or from New York. They look at other places. Sometimes they innovate things themselves. They have a lot of capacity to do so there. But also, they borrow and import policies. They have international style architecture. They have, very similar processes of, tourist buses and so on and so forth. There's tourism systems, Heathrow train, which was a concept that was, I think, borrowed from somewhere else, I think New York, but the idea of an airport train wasn't invented there, but it was taken on, okay? So this is the idea of policy mobility, is the movement of policies across contexts. Now I've got two pictures on the left-hand side there. One shows a complete streets picture. I'll name these in the next slide, and the other one is smart cities. They're two really very trendy mobile policies that are going around the world this decade. And a lot of the things, particularly the smart cities idea, where we're all connected and things all work in with one another, and you can see a picture of where, what time your bus is actually going to arrive, because you can see it on your mobile phone and on a sign and so on and so forth, and everything's Wi-Fi connected and interactive and so forth. This is all what smart cities is about. It's very complex, and everybody's on the bandwagon. Everyone wants a part of it. But it's important to understand the context, the milieu that you are introducing these policies to make sure that they're actually going to be appropriate and really the best for the place. So the policy is a great idea. So you send some people over to see how it works. That's called policy tourism, and there's a whole raft of literature about that. They see the secrets of success, what works, what doesn't, and then they build it into their policy at the city, state and national level. And depending how clever the people are and how critical the people are of what they see overseas or see in another city or at a conference or wherever they're learning it from, depending on how clever they are and critical they are about those things, might dictate how those things are actually implemented in the cities that they're actually working in. which is what my job is to try and introduce you to these ideas so you're a lot more critical about what you're thinking about. When you're thinking about doing tourism planning destinations, it's not just the case of getting another swimming pool on the Esplanade, because everybody has swimming pools on the Esplanade. Okay, now maybe you can get a better one that's more unique and different. Maybe everybody just expects a swimming pool on the Esplanade, but you probably should critically think about that. Probably you shouldn't just be doing it because everyone else does it and you think it's a good idea, or because the state government tells you it's a good idea, or the federal government for that matter. Okay, so some of these policies, smart cities, as I mentioned, creative city thinking, so I've given you a reading on that one. You can look these up if you like. Complete streets, as I mentioned, Esplanade swimming precincts, as I mentioned. The yarn bomb, to my left is the yarn bomb. That's just a bit of a quirky one. I love that one. So I was walking in the streets in Melbourne one day and all the trees had tea cozies on them that were knitted. And I thought, wow, that's fantastic. And then I went to Cygnet, which is where this photo is taken, which is a lovely little town in Tasmania where I'm from. I'm not from Cygnet, but I'm from Tasmania. And it's a bit of an artsy-fartsy place. It's got a folk festival. This was just before the folk festival. And all the rubbish bins and poles and various parts of the town, not city, were knitted, were tea cozied up. It was really quite sensational. It's a travelling policy that's not going to have lasting impact, but it probably needs to have the right context to be taken in the right way. Okay, so when it comes to mobile policies, there's a lot of literature about this. There's two main schools of thought. Peck and Theodore talk about this, and it's part of the readings. There's the rational choice policy transfer, which is this sort of basic belief that, oh, it's a good policy, we'll just go and pick that one up and take it here, and that will drive out the bad policies that we have. And it's we choose to have this policy because we think it's a good one, and we'll just take it from some impartial person, right? The critical policy studies argues that it's much more complicated than that. In Peck and Theodore's words, there is, in other words, an intrinsic politics to the policy transfer process, which is rarely, if ever, just about transferring policy knowledge and technology from A to B. They go on to talk about place, polity and power in some sort of way, but particularly power. For example, Cairns loves Melbourne for whatever reason. So when there's, Cairns is starting to adapt its alleyways, putting street art in, putting cafes in. It's a really cool idea. It's going to be interesting to see how it works. It's been going for a couple of years now. But they've essentially taken that from Melbourne. But there's a power thing. Cairns perceives Melbourne to be more knowledgeable, more sophisticated, more metropolitan. And whilst that may be true from the outset, the thing is Melbourne is Melbourne. Okay, and just because those policies are there in Melbourne doesn't mean that Cairns should have these policies. I'm not saying I don't think it's a good idea, because I kind of like it and I like to see how it works, but it's important to critically think about whether it is actually going to work, whether this is what we want. Do we want to be a metropolitan place? And the critical policy studies gets you to start thinking about power, thinking about feeling subservient to certain cities, to certain places, feeling particularly in a colonial sense. If you're thinking about Singapore, still valuing very highly British ways of doing things. In Hong Kong, they actually did the opposite and rejected a lot of the British ways of doing things, but embraced a lot of the mainland Chinese ways of doing things. And these are the sort of things that it's not, adopting a policy isn't just about finding the best policy and putting it in, because the best policy might actually come from Rio, but we don't see Rio as a place that we want to get our policies from for a lot of reasons, but also we are encouraged as through funding and investment and through our education systems, where the people who are making the decisions are educated, we're constantly encouraged to be looking to the UK or to Melbourne or to the United States for our policy solutions. And this is the point, is to be critical about context. Okay, so nearly finished. Destination resilience, okay? The reason this is important is because if we just uncritically adopt all of these policies and we make all these decisions that might not actually be best for our context, we may lose resilience. Okay, so city resilience describes the capacity of cities to function so that people living and working in cities, particularly the poor and vulnerable, survive and thrive no matter what the stresses or shocks they encounter. Okay, so qualities of resilient systems, according to Arup, who did the City Resilience Framework, is that they're reflective, robust, redundant. Now, it doesn't mean that the city's redundant, it means it has spare capacity. I think they were just trying to get some R's in there. I don't think that was probably the right word, but, you know, good on them. Flexible. Don't know where the R happened there. Okay, resourceful, inclusive, and integrated. Okay, so reflective is a really important one. All of them are really important. Okay, and you can read more about that in the City Resilience Framework. I've got a whole lecture on resilience at the end of this unit. Okay, so this is really, so the thing is that to understand policy, to critically understand yourself as a city through understanding your context, critically thinking about what policies you're actually going to bring in from outside. You know, just because Marriott says they have to have concrete pillars in their front lawn doesn't mean that you say, yes, okay, we'll let you have concrete pillars in your front lawn. It says, no, you're in Cairns now. We don't do concrete pillars, okay? You have to think about us. You have to think about having wooden things and some plantings and so forth. Okay, and that is what critically adopting policy is about. To recap, all right, I hope I'm not moving too fast. Feel free to email me if you've got any questions. Understanding context in terms of place, polity and power can help the critical process of understanding yourself and understanding others. Best practice may not be the same across contexts. Reflecting on practices and being prepared to change or adapt with new information or changing circumstances is critical to resilience, okay? So having capacity within yourself to really think about how you do things and not just uncritically adopt whatever you're told to do. Very important. Uncritical acceptance of external policies can lead to reduced adaptive capacity and thus lower resilience, and being able to adapt is a key part of being resilient. So if you have a big change, like a change in the markets that are travelling, so we don't have Japanese so much anymore, we've got more Chinese, for example, we need to be able to adapt, okay? And we can do that because that situation might not be happening everywhere. We can't borrow policies to help us adapt to that situation. We need to have the capacity within our destination to be able to adapt to those things. Right, okay, so there we go. The next lecture, that's the end. I hope it hasn't been too complex, but I think the messages are relatively clear. They are complex issues, but add complex to context and concepts and it just gets too tricky to think about. Okay, so the next lecture is on governments, governance, policy and regulation. So it's just about frameworks and how things are done in official capacity. And there's a couple of readings. Again, feel free just to summarise, have a bit of a look at the start and end if you don't have time. All right, thank you very much for your time.